Hello and welcome to this lunch briefing session on sustainable agriculture, promise and perils. I'm Dan Graham, Head of Communications at the Graduate Institute, and I'll be moderating today's lunch briefing. Before we begin this session, just a bit of context. Amid intensifying ecological crises and ongoing struggles for social justice, sustainable agriculture is often promoted as a win-win strategy for smallholder producers in the global south. Drawing on research from northern India, this session will explore the promise of sustainable agriculture and discuss the specific challenges that it poses for small farmers as they pursue sustainability certifications and seek access to new markets. Walking us through this interesting topic will be Shaila Seshia Galvin, Associate Professor, Anthropology and Sociology here at the Graduate Institute. Professor Galvin holds a PhD in Anthropology and Forestry and Environmental Studies from Yale University. Her research focuses on agrarian change processes, particularly in India, and has addressed issues related to sustainable agriculture, as well as agricultural biodiversity and intellectual property. Professor Galvin is currently completing a book manuscript based on her doctoral research in northern India, which explores the rise of commercial organic agriculture and along with it, third-party certification, standardization, and contract farming in the first decades of the 21st century. Before handing it over to Shaila, I just wanted to provide a quick overview on how these sessions work. There are two parts to our lunch briefings. The first part will be a presentation from Shaila, and then the second part will be a Q&A session. You can submit your questions in the Q&A section or panel that you see on your screen, and feel free to submit these questions throughout the presentation. You don't have to wait till the end, and I'll get to those questions once we start the Q&A. And with that, I'll hand it over to Shaila. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dan. I'm just going to take a moment to share my screen with you all. All right, I hope you can all see that and hear me clearly. Great.
It's all good.
Perfect. No, so thank you, Dan, so much for the introduction. And I also want to thank Sabrina and Melissa, who are behind the scenes here, helping with the technical aspects of this lunch briefing. And finally, to all of those of you joining online for taking the time out of your day to be here. I'm looking forward to this conversation. I also just want to take a moment before I begin. As Dan mentioned, I've conducted much of my research in India, and in some way, I can't give this lunch briefing today without acknowledging the impact of the pandemic currently in India, including in rural and remote regions, which we sometimes hear less about. But by titling my talk, Sustainable Agriculture's Promise and Perils, what I'm really trying to signal is the often ambivalent or uneven experience that smallholder farmers in the global south have in relation to initiatives that are designed or endeavoring to enroll them in programs that adhere to sustainable standards and certification. The outline of my talk in the next 25-30 minutes or so will be as follows. So I'll begin with an overview of sustainability standards and certification and some of the debates around these. I'll then turn to look at some of the divergent experiences, drawing on the work that I've conducted on certified organic agriculture in Uttarakhand in northern India. From that, I will consider and address some of the issues that may explain or account for this ambivalence or unevenness of outcomes for smallholder producers. And I'll wrap up by flagging a few of the ongoing challenges that sustainability presents in the context of smallholder sustainable farming. I also want to say before I jump in that sustainable agriculture is, as many of you know, I'm sure, a very broad and elastic term. It can be applied to It can be applied to many different agricultural practices and systems. And I just want to sort of specify that for the purposes of this lunch briefing, I'm using the term sustainable agriculture to refer more narrowly to particular forms of agricultural production that employ some form of sustainability standard or certification process, and also that have a commercial aim or ambition. And as we'll see, these two things often go hand in hand. So sustainability standards, and sorry, the slides are jumping a little bit. Sustainability standards and certification have grown rapidly over the last 10 years. And currently there's more than 200 sustainability standards that exist for agricultural commodities alone. You can see here some of the main forms of standards and certifications that are in place for different agricultural commodities, including organic, Rainforest Alliance, UTZ, which you may be familiar with. And there's also several prominent commodities with which these standards are often associated, including cotton, oil palm, cocoa, coffee, and so on. This graphic on the right of the screen is actually taken from the International Trade Center's State of Sustainable Markets report for 2020. And it shows how some of these different standards, there's 14 voluntary sustainability standards that are listed here, how these standards actually map onto different kinds of agricultural commodities. And with this graphic, you can kind of get a sense of how certain standards are really tailored or targeted toward particular commodities, cotton and oil palm being prime examples, while other standards like organic or fair trade, for example, are applied to a broader range of commodities. So standards and certification are often deemed to be important for ensuring that sustainability targets are both set in the first place, that goals are set, but that the standards and these goals are ideally met or realized. Something that I'd like to highlight, though, is that standards also present a novel and important means through which otherwise physically or materially similar agricultural commodities can be distinguished within broader commodity markets. So thinking here, one would be probably hard-pressed to distinguish a fair trade banana from a conventionally produced banana in the absence of some form of sustainability certification or certification mark. And it's in this way that I think sustainability standards and certification schemes shouldn't be seen only as a response to a kind of autonomous consumer demand or independent consumer demand for sustainable products, which is certainly growing. But I would argue that standards and certification are also crucial in themselves in helping to grow and develop markets for sustainable agricultural commodities by stimulating demand on the one hand, and by also creating novel means for creating or establishing, enhancing the market value of commodities. So when it comes to smallholder producers in the global south, then the promise of sustainable agriculture and certified sustainable agriculture lies in the way it holds out the possibility of realizing both social and ecological benefits, as well as income generation for small producers. And this is the kind of win-win strategy or the win-win ideal that's often associated in relation to sustainable agriculture. I want to note too that this is an area of growing interest, and on the right here you can see a link to a recent benchmarking exercise that was undertaken by the UN Forum on Sustainability Standards, which is attempting to map the relations and the potential complementarities between sustainability standards or voluntary sustainability standards, VSS, and the Sustainable Development Goals. But a question that I want to pose that also comes out of some of the literature that's been generated around sustainable agriculture is whether this kind of great promise of sustainable agriculture, at least in relation to smallholder farmers, remains somewhat unrealized. And recent research has shown that there are often very mixed effects that sustainability standards and certification have for small producers. So there is unevenness and variation that's observed in relation to the extent to which standards and certification improve net income for farmers or wages for agricultural workers. There's similar variation in the impacts on employment conditions and labor protections. In relation to questions of gender equity, the impacts of sustainable agriculture are similarly mixed, as well as in the realms of food security, health, and education. Some other literature looks not only, or looks less at the impacts on small producers, but considers also the ways in which smallholder producers may be inadequately involved in the kind of governance and standard setting processes around these schemes. And this is despite the fact that small producers and smallholders' stories or images are often used in the branding and the marketing of sustainable products. So while on the one hand, smallholders may be very visible and prominent in certain ways, in other respects, when it comes to decision-making power, voting rights in governing bodies of these associations, the role that they play and the voice that they have may be much more ambivalent. What I would like to also suggest in thinking about the unrealized promise is that while this research has really done a lot to highlight both uneven impacts and questions of governance, in research and analysis itself, smallholders' perspectives and experience are often not adequately reflected. Certainly research on issues like net income and the points that are listed at the top of the slide remain and are important concerns for smallholder farmers. But these domains don't necessarily capture the full complexity of the experience that farmers have when they try to take on and adhere to sustainability standards and certification. So at this juncture, I want to shift my talk to Uttarakhand and to really try and draw out some of the experiences that smallholders in northern India, in Uttarakhand, had with efforts to become certified organic. So the state of Uttarakhand in northern India, which you can see on the map on the right, was actually created in the year 2000. And shortly after its creation, Uttarakhand, the state government, declared its ambition to become India's first organic state. I began my research there in 2005 and conducted 20 months of ethnographic work between 2005 and 2008, and again in 2016. As an anthropologist, much of this involved fieldwork in both state bureaucracies as well as in two rural locales in Dehradun district in Western Uttarakhand. So the first in the Western Himalaya, the lower Himalaya, and the second in the Dune Valley surrounding the state capital of Dehradun. The larger research project that I undertook examined what becoming organic means and entails for Uttarakhand's smallholder farmers in the wake of both the formation of the state in the year 2000 and in the midst of rising concern about environmental impacts of agriculture and ongoing reforms within India's agricultural sector. And I've put a note at the bottom to my book, which is now complete and will soon be available. But what I'd like to highlight here, drawing on this research in a very kind of brief way, is that experiences of certified organic agriculture were really very uneven, both within these two rural locales, but also between agricultural communities. So both within the Western Himalaya and the Dune Valley, as well as between these two sites and places. And I'll take a moment to just describe a bit the context of this unevenness. So this is a photo from the village of Nagtari in the lower Himalaya, the Western Himalaya, where I conducted part of my research. Here, agricultural systems are diverse. They're largely rain-fed. There's very little irrigation. And producers really mix production both for subsistence as well as for commercial sale in government mandis and government marketing yards. What I found in Nagtari is that certified organic agriculture was something that was most actively pursued by dominant castes, so high caste families and households in the village who really had both the kind of capital in terms of land, financial and labor resources to draw on in investing in and taking risks with organic production. And that the village's low caste and more marginal farmers, for them, organic agriculture was often something beyond what they could aspire to. Oops. So what I would say here, though, is that despite the ways in which some of these dominant caste households were really very enthusiastic and remain enthusiastic about the promise of certified organic agriculture, this was a promise that has yet to be realized. So to this day, more than 10 years after enrolling in the organic certification program, residents of Nagtari who are interested in organic agriculture have yet to succeed in finding a market for their organic produce. So the story is somewhat different in the Dune Valley in Uttarakhand, surrounding the state capital of Dehradun. Here, as you can see from the photo, agricultural production looks quite different. Agriculture is typically irrigated and it forms a rice-wheat rotation. Farmers and agricultural producers actually often hold jobs in Dehradun, in the state capital. And so farming is something that they do really as a supplement to other income that they get. And they sell their crops both in the government mandi, as did producers in Nagtari. But they also have a contract arrangement, a contract farming arrangement with one of India's large rice retailers to produce organic basmati rice for export. So since 2005, organic farmers in this region have had and have contracted with rice retailers to pursue organic basmati production. And for this purpose, they're organized into farmers' federations, which are units both of certification, but also of contract farming. Although, unlike in Nagtari, where markets and institutional arrangements were really inchoate and difficult to develop, while these arrangements exist in the Dune Valley, the experience with organic agriculture and certification was also mixed, but for somewhat different reasons. So farmers in the Dune Valley faced challenges with the federations sometimes, and the ways in which the federations managed the funds and payments that farmers were to receive. Farmers also expressed concerns about the contract price for basmati rice. So under contract farming, the price of the crop is pre-agreed between the buyer and the seller. And many farmers expressed concerns that the price that they were receiving for producing organic basmati was really not sufficient to compensate them for costs that they incurred through the production process. A number also expressed and shared the difficulties that they faced in complying not with organic standards, but with other standards that are often associated with contract farming. So standards related to other qualities and the regulation of quality in agricultural commodities. So to turn now to perhaps providing a bit of a summary or a discussion of what we can draw from this and what might explain these uneven outcomes of certified organic agriculture in these different regions of Uttarakhand. I think one thing that stands out and that's immediately obvious is that different agroecological conditions and different systems of agriculture play a very important role in determining the possibilities that smallholders have for pursuing certified organic farming. So in mountainous settings like Nagtari, where farmers really grow a great diversity of crops, where their fields are spread over large areas, and where villages may lack connections with roads and other communication infrastructure, farmers may have difficulty accessing markets and accessing potential buyers, but they may also have difficulty complying with the expectations of those buyers. And so here, with organic, certified organic production that is commercialized, this can come with new and sometimes onerous production imperatives. So buyers require farmers to produce in far larger volumes, far larger quantities than they're typically accustomed to producing, and to have uniformity and a uniformity across the crops that they produce. In Nagtari, this was much more difficult to realize precisely because of the agroecological context of smallholder farming, while in the Dune Valley, these kinds of imperatives were something that were more readily achievable. I think a third issue that emerges from these two studies or study sites is the importance of institutional arrangements as well as governance issues. So as I mentioned in Nagtari, institutional arrangements for grouping producers together to produce in the volume and the quantity required by buyers was something that really didn't exist, and that residents in the region, even those who wish to pursue organic farming, have had difficulty creating. In the Dune Valley, institutional arrangements were more present in the form of farmers' federations that kind of aggregated and grouped farmers together for certification and contract. But these federations sometimes faced internal governance issues. Some federations worked tremendously well and have been very successful, and have grown and diversified the range of products that they offer today. But others, plagued by governance issues, including issues around the payments, farmers receiving late payments for goods, for paddy that they sold to the rice retailer. So issues of late payments, non-payments, and problems within the Federation led farmers to sometimes abandon organic farming, and in some cases for these federations to be disbanded altogether. Fourth, I think what emerges particularly clearly in the case of Nagtari is the way that social and economic inequalities that predate and pre-exist the introduction of organic agriculture can play a real role in the ways and the extent to which farmers are able to access it or benefit from it. In the book, I argue that organic agriculture is introduced in a landscape that is stratified socially, culturally, and economically, and that it can work to further stratify, further exacerbate inequalities within communities. And this is something that was particularly perceptible in relation to distinctions between high and low caste households in the village of Nagtari. And finally, in the case of the Dune Valley, where farmers were able to establish contract farming arrangements with a rice retailer, they faced issues and challenges around what I've called indirect standardization. So this is to say that while we may think of sustainability standards in terms of, strictly speaking, the standards, for example, for organic production and processing, in reality, smallholder farmers, by enrolling in an organic program with a commercial end, with a contract attached to it, also have to comply with a range of different quality standards that are required by the buyers. So in the case of organic basmati rice, for example, this meant that the grains, that farmers' fields were inspected and their rice paddy was inspected to kind of ascertain that grains of rice had a uniform length and met particular standards for grain length. That they conformed to certain kind of color requirements and had meant that the grains of rice had minimal discoloration, which can sometimes occur for varying reasons in rice crops, and that the grains also met certain length-breadth ratios. These are standards that the government of India has set for rice that is to basmati rice that is to be exported. But it is through contract farming that smallholders in the Dune Valley also came to have to take on and reckon with a much broader suite of standards. And as you can imagine, for some of them, this proved conforming to these quality standards proved quite difficult. So to conclude then, I think one of the issues that I'd like to end with is that the kind of unevenness that we observe with outcomes to date really underscores the way in which it's crucial for programs that seek to reach and bring sustainability standards and certification programs to smallholder farmers. It's crucial for them to be very kind of finely tuned to the diversity of smallholder farming and the diversity of smallholder experiences. This means a kind of attunement to variations in agroecological contexts and differing production systems, but it also means an attunement to the ways in which social and economic inequalities really shape and determine the experience that heterogeneous groups of smallholders have with certification. I think another kind of closing observation is that while it may be tempting to see sustainability standards and certification really as about achieving certain social or ecological outcomes, for smallholders themselves, these standards and certification schemes have much broader ramifications. And they may really significantly shape or reshape agrarian relations, forms of local governance, and institutions. And finally, maybe one of the most vexing questions, I think, is the fact that what is deemed often necessary and valuable for commercially oriented sustainable agriculture and for buyers, right? This need and the value of being able to have a guaranteed volume or quantity of production and a kind of uniformity or a standardized way in which the agricultural commodities are themselves standardized and uniform to some degree, can really exist and be at odds with what is deemed valuable and necessary in smallholder systems. So in returning to Nagtari, in smallholder mountain systems, agricultural systems, the diversity both within and across varieties is something that is integral and has been integral to the resilience of these farming systems, and yet it exists at odds with the requirements and the expectations of buyers. So I think this raises the question of whether it is possible to reconcile these different principles and values, and whether perhaps there is a need to rethink standardization principles and processes in the particular context of developing certified sustainable smallholder farming. So I will leave it there, and I very much look forward to discussion and questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Shaila. That was really good. And we have received a few questions throughout the presentation. So I'll just start getting into them if you're all right with that. The first one is actually a first comment. So just thank you for this great webinar. And the question is as follows. Based on your experience, what's the view of investors about VSS, so voluntary sustainability standards? Do VSSs help SMEs, so small medium enterprises, to access finance? That's the question, because the comment is at IISD, so the International Institute for Sustainable Development. We are addressing this question. Do VSS help in mitigating the risk of investing in SMEs? And the final comment was, and I would be glad to exchange with you all the benefit from your views. Thanks. That's the question.
Okay, great. No, it's a great question, and I think it also shows how much work is ongoing and how much interest is ongoing in this area. So if I understood correctly, the question is really about whether voluntary sustainability standards mitigate some of the risks for small and medium enterprises. And I guess here I'm thinking perhaps of potential small buyers or investors in sustainable programs rather than necessarily the farming communities themselves. I think certainly there is a way in which, yes, sustainability standards can provide that kind of assurance to buyers, including buyers from small and medium enterprises. And what I observed in India is that while in the Dune Valley, as I described, it was quite a large rice retailer, one of India's largest rice retailers that had formed a contract farming arrangement, there was actually quite a lot of small and medium enterprises, and I think even more so now, that were interested in procuring organic products from smallholder farmers in Uttarakhand. And for them, the existence of organic standards and certification program and the kind of backing that this had from the state government and the oversight from the state government was critical, I think, in mitigating some of these risks. But that said, I think that there was always this tension, because these small and medium enterprises came with certain expectations of being able to procure really quite vast quantities of pulses, lentils, grains from the mountains, quantities that were even beyond what a single village would produce. And so this is where, in a way, the promise or the potential promise that sustainable markets have was unrealized, because of the volume requirements and because of the kinds of standards that buyers expected smallholder farmers to comply with. Yeah.
Great, thank you for that. A few more questions have come in. So the next one is, again, thank you for your presentation. I'm wondering, thinking of the Uttarakhand case, can we understand organic agriculture as a kind of privilege? Organic agriculture is used by families with higher incomes. Do we know why low-income farmers, I don't know if it's prepare or prefer non-organic farming? Does more important revenues lead to a kind of comfort that would allow to question the usual habits?
Yeah, no, also, yeah, super question. I think that there's a range of, possible ways of responding to it. One thing I would say is that, I guess, in many ways, farmers in Nagtari and in the lower Himalaya, whether they are pursuing certified organic agriculture or not, it's not that they are pursuing necessarily what we would think of as conventional, agriculture using synthetic inputs. There's a way in which production in particularly these mountain environments has been seen to be organic by default. So even small and marginal poor farmers are nominally organic, right? Conforming to, if not organic standards, then certainly not using synthetic inputs, and indirectly meeting many of the criteria for organic production. The issue is that they're not able to participate in these schemes, or don't participate in these schemes, in part because for them it is a risk. In the lower Himalaya, one had to take risks with committing fields to certified organic production, and in the end there often wasn't a market for these crops. And given that farmers often have to invest more labor time and more resources in the cultivation of organic crops, for many, this was a risk. For many marginal farmers, this was a risk that they simply couldn't take. So for that's one of the reasons why I think one has seen less participation of more marginal farmers in organic programs, and why perhaps here at least it may be a privilege of farmers who are already more well resourced, and who actually turned to organic agriculture and certification as a means. I remember one farmer told me it distinguished him from the common farmer. So to be able to produce organically was also, in a sense, a mark of distinction, right? And conferred some sort of further social status or cultural capital.
Great, thanks for that, Shaila. A few more questions have come in, so here's the next one. Since the entire state is kind of forced to go organic, are your findings replicable to areas where farmers actively choose to go organic?
Yeah, no, I guess one thing I would say there is that farmers weren't forced to become organic. The state sort of declared its intention to become fully organic, and there were efforts underway to enroll as many farmers as possible in this organic program. But in the end, those who enrolled, some didn't enroll for different, some didn't want, for example, the burden of having to conform to certification requirements, of having to be responsive or deal with the uncertainties that could exist around contract farming arrangements and payments and so on. So there were ways in which some farmers who opted in ended up opting out, and ways in which some farmers chose never to opt in the first place. I think, you know, as again, speaking as an anthropologist, I'm always hesitant about sort of saying that this is replicable to other contexts. I think that one of my concluding points was actually that that the experience of sustainable agriculture certification and standardization is incredibly varied. There's not a one-size-fits-all approach, and in some ways, I think kind of looking beyond replicability, we also have to look to and account for the diversity of this experience.
Great, thank you. Next question is, could you please expand on your understanding of organic versus sustainable versus regenerative agriculture? Some organic and sustainable farmers still use chemicals. Regenerative focuses on improving soil health, improving biodiversity, and animal and human health.
Yeah, no, so I think that's a great point. And the way I use organic is really in the way it's come to be understood in regulatory contexts. And so organic is actually somewhat different from other kinds of sustainability standards or certification schemes that you might find, in that it is states and governments that create organic standards, and that even if even if the certification is undertaken privately, the standards themselves are sort of set within a public regulatory context. And so there's also a way in which private associations have a role in developing guidelines for what standards should be, et cetera. So there's quite a mix between a mix of both public and private regulation in the organic space. But I think, you know, the point is well taken that organic and regenerative agriculture can be different things. And I think one of the criticisms, I suppose, of organics that has emerged in the last decade or a bit more than a decade is that it can sometimes come to replicate or resemble conventional agriculture. So instead of synthetic fertilizers, you have organic fertilizers, right? Rather than looking at how does one encourage and facilitate soil health and soil ecology, farm ecologies in a more kind of holistic way. So I'm using organic in that more limited sense, but really recognizing that there's a much broader way in which we can understand sustainable agriculture.
Great, thank you. Next question is, can you say anything about what would have been the situation for farmers if they didn't have to produce organic?
Yeah, so I think it would, I think again, it varies. I think in the mountains, in Nagtari, for example, you know, because the promise of agricultural markets for organic products hasn't been realized, smallholder farming continues, and They continue to produce both for subsistence as well as certain cash crops for these government mandis. But these crops, even if they're produced without, the inputs that are forbidden and under organic standards, are still sold. They're not sold as organic in government mandis. They're sold as conventional crops. There's no distinctions that are made there. I think in the Dune, so in some ways, I think this is for those farmers who want to pursue organic, it's a case of committing some of their land, for those who have it, to experimenting with producing ginger, for example, for a few years, then perhaps producing kidney beans, and so on. And so there's this element of risk taking, and that some of these farmers are able to take. And this is ongoing. In the Dune Valley, again, farmers have for those who some have quite a number, in fact, opted out of organic farming. The program there is actually much smaller today than it was when I conducted my initial research. And I think for these farmers, simply the demands of producing under a contract farming arrangement made were too great for them to bear, in a context where these are people who also hold jobs in banks or shops in the city, and who don't commit their time to agriculture on a full-time basis. So there's ways in which they continue to farm. They also farm varieties that they wouldn't otherwise be able to cultivate under a contract, because the rice retailer requires them and actually gives them the seeds to grow. So gives that they're required to plant. Not participating in a contract program means that to some extent they can choose which varieties of rice they grow each year, and there's a market for it in the government mandi. And in fact, because so much of basmati rice is exported, and because this is a region that's actually very famous for basmati rice, residents of Dehradun who can't find or have difficulty accessing basmati in local shops in Dehradun will actually drive out to these farms sometimes and buy directly from farmers. So there's different marketing arrangements that exist around basmati. That means that farmers there continue to have different options that are available to them.
Great, thank you for that. We have just over 10 minutes left, and there's still quite a few questions, so I'm going to try to go through as many as I can. The next one is, according to you, which factors can be taken into consideration to determine sustainability of agriculture vis-a-vis social economic impact?
So which factors should be?
So the question is, according to you, which factors can be taken into consideration to determine sustainability of agriculture versus or vis-a-vis social economic impact?
I'm not sure. I hope I've got it, but I suppose my initial response would be that they're interconnected, that the social and the economic is at least at the level of, in the ways that smallholder farmers experience this, is interconnected with questions, are inseparable in some ways from questions of sustainability. And so, farmers' decisions about which crops to plant, whether to use fertilizers, if so, how much, these are all sort of shaped or co-constituted together. So in some ways, I think it can be difficult to pick out sort of particular markers of sustainability, but I suppose what I would maybe say is that I think I think that there's scope for being for perhaps a more kind of finely tuned awareness of the diversities of smallholder systems, and the kind of, again, the heterogeneity of them, the ways in which relations of power, of inequality that have to do with gender, but also have to do with other, you know, caste, class, other distinctions, the ways in which these really come to shape and condition the extent to which sustainable programs are able to take root, and who is able to kind of reap the benefits or the promise of them.
Great, thank you for that. In the next question, it's basically, in your research, which one is the bigger obstacle for smallholders complying to sustainable certifications? And there's a list of items here. Higher cost of adherence, so auditing cost, land legality, etc. Low uptake demand from traders, mills down the supply chain, or changing the mindset of the smallholders in producing in more standardized, sustainable ways. So which of those three are the biggest obstacles? The cost of adherence, the low uptake, or changing the mindset?
So I would say it's a difficult choice to make. I would say that the cost, to some extent, the cost of adhering to these programs, and by here I'm also include more than sort of strict economic costs, in terms of the price that farmers receive or the wages that they have to pay. But for many smallholders, it is their own time as well. And so organic production in Uttarakhand, as elsewhere, often requires or can require more time, because things like weeding may need to be done manually, and pest control may need to be done sort of in using more labor. So I think there's a cost of a question of the cost of adherence here. But I also think the issue of standardization is a very vexing one, as I said at the end. And you know, I guess the question I would ask back is it that smallholders need to change their mindset? It's in some ways that smallholder systems are often very kind of adapted to the environments in which they're set. Or is there scope for changing mindsets around standardization when it comes to reaching smallholder farmers? You know, given in some ways that I think there's increasing value, particularly in consumer markets, for more diverse products, for products and commodities that may not be kind of perfectly uniform. Is there scope for adjusting or changing how we think, or how buyers, suppliers, retailers think about standardization? I guess that's a question, an open question I would ask.
Great, thank you for that. We have 5 minutes left. I'll see if we can get through 2 questions at least, and there's still quite a few, so apologies we can't get to all of your questions. But here's the next question. For a smallholder producer or farmer, do you think it's easy to reach sustainable agriculture due to agricultural practices?
Is it difficult to reach sustainable agriculture due to agricultural practices?
Yes, that is the question, yeah.
I think it varies depending on where you're looking at. I think certainly in some areas, I think the kind of agricultural practices, and it also varies depending on what kind of sustainable practices you're considering, because I've spoken about organic standards, but there's different kinds of sustainability standards and certification. I think in Uttarakhand, it was not, the issue was not so much that about the agricultural practices themselves, but more about other kinds of standardization that often came with organic farming under a contract arrangement. And so in the mountains, as I said, smallholder farmers were often producing essentially in an organic way, but not able to take part in certification programs, or not able to reach organic markets. So I would say, at least in Uttarakhand, it's perhaps to some extent less about the practices and more about broader questions of governance, standardization. I think, if you look in other regions of the world, I think the equation may be different, because certainly when one's talking about larger farms and different scales of production, then the kind of demands that certainly organic agriculture can make can present a more make adopting organic practices more complicated.
Great, thank you for that. All right, with 3 minutes left, here's one last question. Hopefully we could do it in 2 minutes. The person saying, thank you very much for the presentation. Why in the Dune Valley is it easy or more easy for small farmers to be certified as organic?
So I think one thing, and here again, I come back to the heterogeneity of smallholding. So although there's farmers in the Dune Valley, are also many of them smallholders, in that typically they cultivate less than 2 hectares of land. There's a way in which that some of the institutional arrangements that are necessary for certification were more easily established in a plains region. Farms and villages were better connected by roads, for example. The proximity to the state capital meant that there was more kind of back and forth contact with certification bodies, with the state bureaucracy, with extension services, and with prospective buyers. And I think for all these reasons, in a sense, it was easier for federations to form with relatively large numbers. So between 1 and 400 households would be part of each federation, 100 and 400 households. And and so I think, there were these different kind of characteristics of farming systems and broader kind of infrastructure proximity to the state capital, to urban markets, that made this a more realistic, or maybe not realistic, but made this a more achievable pursuit for these farmers.
Great, thank you. That was perfect timing. It's exactly 1:30 Geneva time. So Shaila, thank you so much for your presentation and answering all these questions. I also want to thank everyone who joined us and all of the questions that came in. Apologies that we couldn't answer every single question, but we're going to wrap up and just let you all know that this has been recorded and will soon be on the Graduate Institute's YouTube channel. So Shaila, thank you once again. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.